very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. And it's an absolute pleasure to welcome you to Follow the Sun, 24 hours of broadcasting right across the world, to celebrate the launch of the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022, produced in conjunction with the US News and Wharton Business School. It's a pleasure to have you join us for this session. This broadcast is going to travel right across the world, starting in New Zealand and ending 24 hours later in the USA. We have an absolutely packed broadcast today. This year's Best Countries study is our fullest and most comprehensive yet. The attitudes of global business leaders, opinion formers and citizens towards nation strengths has changed dramatically in recent years, never more so than in 2022. And we'll be looking at how those changes in values have impacted overall perceptions of our 85 nations covered in the 2022 study. But perceptions of a country only tell half the story. We'll then visit 24 countries to hear what's happening from WPP experts on the ground, and sometimes how perceptions of a country don't really reflect the situation. Now, our time together promises to be informative, challenging, stimulating, and I hope fun. So let's get started. How a country is viewed around the world is of huge importance, politically, economically, and socially. It has the ability to contribute to both a nation's hard and soft power. The Romans understood this well. SPQR, an abbreviation for Centanus Populosque Romanus, was arguably the first country branding. It was an emblematic, abbreviated phrase referring to the government of the ancient Roman Republic. You only needed to see the emblem, and invaded countries knew exactly what was in store for them. So country branding itself is not new, but measuring it is. Now in our 7th year, the WPP BAV Annual Best Countries Rankings measures global perceptions of countries against a series of characteristics, impressions that have the potential to drive trade, travel and investment. They also directly affect brands. The study was developed by WPP BAV, the Wharton Business School of the University of Pennsylvania, and US News. The ranking is based on a large global survey which asks a range of people about how they perceive different countries against a range of key attributes. Country branding also has a significant impact on corporate and product brands. The words "made in" can instantly lend credibility and trust to a product or brand that a consumer hasn't previously encountered. That could be enough to convince someone to buy, and beyond that, convince them to pay a premium. Likewise, "made in" can prove an instant turn-off if a consumer associates the country of origin with poor safety standards or sees it as being behind the times on social issues or workers' rights. But it's not just a one-way reaction. The perceptions and performance of brands abroad feed back into the development of the country itself. Additionally, willingness for corporates to invest vital FDI is also closely linked to the strength of a country's brand. As local brands and businesses succeed, they generate economic growth as well as lending further positive associations to their country's brand. There's a close relationship between how people feel about a country and their attitudes towards the brand they associate with that country. Strong countries fuel strong brands and vice versa. Think of France and Chanel. Both represent elegance, glamour and prestige. Chanel is intrinsically French, and France is synonymous with Chanel. The same can be said of Italy and Ferrari, or Japan and Sony. In each case, brands and the countries are part of a virtuous circle, a symbiotic relationship. In fact, Germany is a really fine example of this symbiosis in action. Germany has come to represent the qualities of durability and engineering that brands like Bosch, BMW, Audi and Mercedes have shown the world that Germany can deliver. Brands can both shape and be shaped by the perceptions of their country of origins. Japan in the 1970s was known as a cheap manufacturing base, but now respected as a world leader for quality electronics and also technology, thanks largely to brands like Sony and Toyota. South Korea has taken a similar path, with Samsung and Hyundai demonstrating to the entire world what modern South Korea is and is doing, so creating consumer predisposition in international markets that favour other South Korean brands. There's a two-way reaction and a multiplier effect for both. This year's study quantifies the impact. We see that 83% of consumers globally agree that consumer brands play an important role in defining a country's culture. 78% also agree that the country a product is made in impacts my preference to purchase it. Our annual Best Countries ranking was first launched in 2016 at the World Economic Forum meeting in Davos, the world's largest gathering of global leaders and heads of industry and influence. It's now in its 7th year, and given how turbulent the past 7 years have been across the globe, enables us to see the impact of the changes. The Best Country ranking incorporates the views of close to 18,000 individual members of the public and business decision makers, surveyed in 85 countries across the world. This year's survey was completed in mid-2022. Collectively, the 85 countries in the 2022 rankings account for about 95% of global gross domestic product per capita and represent 80% of the world's population. Individuals surveyed for Best Countries were asked how closely they associated 73 attributes with a range of countries. These attributes were then grouped into 10 categories that were used to calculate the Best Countries ranking, and more on those attributes later. So come with me as we meet our first guests on our interview stage. Well, I'm very delighted now to be joined by Lord Jim O'Neill, the former Chief Economist of Goldman Sachs and a former government UK Minister and Chairman of Chatham House. Jim, Lord O'Neill, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me on.
President Zelensky has said that the price we have to pay for avoiding a third world war is going to be higher energy bills, increases in the cost of living, and a reduction in living standards. And this comes at a time where we see from our BAV Best Countries study that softer values, sort of like quality of life and social purpose, are much more important in defining a nation's brand. But do you think that public opinion at the moment will pressurise governments to hold their current policies, or do you think they will start to look at alternatives?
Nice, easy question that you start with. I don't know, because it is probably for my generation, never mind the younger generation, the first such issue of this scale and complexity that we've seen. So far, it appears Western nations, who are the prime supporters of Ukraine, of course, have been happy to support the government stance on Ukraine, and superficially accept the cost, which is essentially this enormous cost of living shock. But it remains to be seen how that passes the test of time. So as we're seeing here, the government itself is almost definitely going to have to pay for the cost of this dilemma. I can't help finishing my answer to this very tricky question by also pointing out that if we really want to be serious about climate change and alternative energies, having a permanently higher price for carbon emitting energy forms is probably ultimately the sort of thing that is needed. One would imagine accelerate the desire for alternative energies to become more and more part of everyday life.
Now, you were chairman of the Chatham House, one of the world's leading think tanks. Its mission of a world that is sustainable, secure and prosperous is great. What do you feel, how far are we from realising that goal?
Isn't and hasn't really worked the way it's supposed to do on the tin.
So Jim, what should the priorities of nations be then now?
Yeah, so what should we do about it? You know, I've become linked to a number of things I've been involved in, a big believer in what I broadly call profit with purpose. And we need to have business itself think more about the societal remit of who ultimately they serve. We've lived in an era, and still do, of where the only thing that matters for many, certainly publicly quoted business, is the shareholder. And it's not enough. And private business shouldn't be rewarded if we don't have productivity that goes with these big gains for them. And policymakers need to be more alert to the realities of life rather than just what was in economic textbooks of the 1960s and 70s. And if we don't learn from that, I have a fear that some of the dilemmas that have just blown up dramatically in the past few years out of nowhere could actually get worse.
Now, we started with a hard question, so let's end with an easy one. Lord O'Neill, are you an optimist or a pessimist given the situation we see around the world today?
Right now, I feel a lot more pessimistic than I've done for a long time. However, that said, I've been around the policy area in many different forms for over 40 years, and I've lived through a lot of crises. And the one thing I know for sure is that the crisis you're in, even though it often seems the worst you've ever been through, they come to an end. And one of the big things I've learned is never let a crisis go to waste. And indeed, the making of a business, a leader, or of a country is how they respond to the crisis you are in, because it normally defines how you're going to deal with the future era. So in that sense, there are lots of ways of things that could emerge from all of this mess in a more positive way.
Well, Lord Jim O'Neill, ending on a slightly more positive note than we started, thank you very much indeed for joining us. It's been a privilege to hear what you have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me joining you.
As we travel around the world together in our Follow the Sun broadcast, we'll be hearing news, views and insights from local WPP company colleagues in 24 of the 85 countries covered in the WPP BAV Best Countries study for 2022. Now, before we go to one of those countries, let's remind ourselves of the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 rankings from the 85th down to the number 1 country. Let's see what the overall findings of Best Countries 2022 are before we go to Canada for local insights from the WPP team there. And don't forget to download the Best Countries Metaverse experience for even more global insights from the address on your screen. Historically, military power and finance, banks and tanks were the attributes against which we measured a country's power in the world. Not anymore. So what does all this mean? It shows that a nation focused on providing great quality of life for its people, which cares about the rights and equality, and has a focus on entrepreneurship, is seen as having the most powerful nation brand. This reflects a world today and the factors that influence public perceptions and consumer decision-making, and by implication, a nation's political policy making. So let's take a look at those 10 factors and their weights for 2022. Entrepreneurship, 14.2%. Cultural influence, 10.4%. Power, 5%. Heritage, 3.1%. Adventure, 5.5%. Quality of life, 14.5%. Open for business, 9.3%. Social purpose, 13.5%. Agility, 14%. Movers, 10.6%. So it's clearly no longer just tanks and banks that give a country influence around the world. Softer power, which comes about as a result of entrepreneurship and cultural exports, is increasingly making an impact.
Thanks for joining our Best Country BAV Best Country panel this year. This is my second year doing it. We had a lot of fun last year. We'll just kind of go back and forth and have a chat. But why don't we start by introduction? So I'm Arthur Fleischman, Country Manager for WPP here in Canada. Michelle, do you want to introduce yourself? You're at the top of my screen, so.
Sure. I'm Michelle Regan. I'm a VP at Hill & Knowlton, and I lead the creative strategy team.
And how about you, Rafiq?
All right. Well, I'm Rafiq Belmez. I'm the head of strategy at Taxi in Canada.
And Gotham.
Hey everyone, I'm Gautam. I'm EVP Performance and Innovation at Group M.
So the three of you might represent the smartest people we have. No pressure.
Good.
Questionable.
Questionable. Listen, I'm really happy to have a chat about this because it's obviously a topic near and dear to our heart. Canada being a relatively small country and yet being in WPP's top 10 markets. It's a very sophisticated market, and yet it's a small market, which means we have to be scrappier and more innovative with budgets because our clients are sophisticated but don't always have the resources to do everything that our brethren south of the border can do. So anyway, we're happy to be here to chat. As we talked about when we were getting ready for this call, you're aware of the Best Countries study. You know that it measures countries on a number of attributes, things like social purpose and quality of life and entrepreneurship, how open our country is to business and how agile we are. And last year, Canada ranked number one, and the ratings are tied to GDP. So it's a weighted rating. So not every rating is equal. But this year we slipped to number 3. And while we continue to be defined by what I'll call sort of soft skills, high quality of life and agility, we struggle on the commercial side. We're not perceived as being open for business. We're not perceived as being a powerful, high impact nation on culture and so forth. And at least two of you have lived outside of Canada. I'm American. I've lived outside of Canada. How do you react to that with your worldview? Anyone can start us off. It's just a discussion.
Okay, I can go. So it's quite interesting in comparison. I'd say especially with my experience in Asia, the speed to which businesses try and pivot and think through is a lot faster. But what's interesting though is, which for me has been completely new, is that there is, from the get-go, there's a lot more focus of depth and the impact of what you do to your surroundings, to the people around you, than you would necessarily see in a lot of the other markets. And I think there is positive and negative sides to it. The negative is always perceived as, hey, okay, that doesn't let you go to market fast enough, or that's basically you not being agile enough. But I also believe that the positive side of it is that when you think things through and when you get to a certain point, this thinking does allow you to lay stronger foundations and roots. And probably that also leads to the point of the number of failing startups is probably a lot lesser as well, as compared to the percentage that set up shop. So that's my
so I'm going to restate what I think I heard you say and tell me if I missed that. But it sounds like that we are more careful, we're more thoughtful about the impact of our actions. That inherently slows us down a bit and therefore may reduce our perception of being renegade and mavericks and high.
Yeah, and it's probably due to both cultural ways of thinking, but also due to structural ones that the government lays out to you. The government doesn't let you go from point A to B to C as easily as you would be able to do it in, let's say, a Singapore or anywhere else. And it's a mix of these two that kind of bring that out.
Yeah. Rafiq and Michelle, do you have a different perspective on why we might not have the same impact on the world perceptually in the areas of culture and business that we do in the area of quality of life and sort of the caring attributes?
I think, Michelle, if you want to go first.
No, you go. All good.
No, I'll go. All right. So in terms of business, I kind of like agree with what Gotham said, right? And for me, there's this soundbite that was going around like maybe in November 2020, right? So like phase 2 of the pandemic, where the US was reopening and everybody kept saying around me that the US has chosen business over health, right? Which I think is like a small encapsulation of what you're saying, Gotham, right? Like of taking actions in order to sort of like look at the impact on people around you and the population. And it's always like the 3 Ps, like people, planet, profit. That I think we can say like certainly Canada cares about more than the US, right? So I think that might be one of the reasons why maybe we're perceived as slower, and I think we are slower because we were slower in reopening than a lot more countries out there. So I think that's one thing. The other piece you touched on, Arthur, I think has been discussed at length in this panel last year around culture and how our artists, like popular though they are, feel American. Like when our artists become successful, like Drake, The Weeknd, like Seth Rogen, Ryan Gosling, they almost feel their success feels American. So like when they explode on the global scene, when they grow up, they forget to wave the Canadian flag. So and I don't know, I don't have the answer as to why, but I know it's definitely a thing. Like, and it's not just in music or in the arts. If you think about like Elon Musk is kind of Canadian, you know, like he lived in Toronto for a while. The founder of Ethereum is Canadian, but they don't wave the Canadian flag. He's not Canadian. He lived in Canada. So I think it's not just a perception; it's a reality.
Did you want to build on that, Michelle?
Sure. Yeah, I think kind of taking a step back, when you look at two of our biggest areas, telecom, banking, where some of our strongest Canadian brands are. They're highly regulated, but they really have created that foundation. So they play a different role in people's lives because there's such a nationwide application where I don't think in other countries you could sort of say the same. So while it may be slower, there is sort of more of a safety and a stability that I think Canadians and other people have come to trust Canadians for. And then to touch on the point about reopening with COVID, I think it's interesting when you look at the low death rate that Canada experienced compared to other G10 countries. In Canada, the debate was really around the cost to freedom, the cost to, the loss of societal functions, the cost to businesses, and people asked, was it worth it? And I think, it's an interesting question to look at in comparison to business to kind of, Gotham, what you were talking about initially.
Yeah, it's interesting because I was going to ask the question, what do you think about 2021 and 2 might have led to the slip in our numbers? But I think you've hit the nail on the head. It's COVID related, and our response to COVID, we've leaned into the caring, nurturing, trust driving attributes, which is a good thing, but that plays directly against things like, movers, impact on culture. Like, we are decidedly a not sexy country, which might be, why on one hand, all of our stars, celebrities, whatever, are thought of as American, because you don't tend to think of Canada as creating a celebrity culture
I think you're scratching at something super interesting, which is the idea of being caring and nurturing and caring about people is at odds with sort of like being cool and sexy and business success. So yeah, I think it's very interesting, right? And I don't know if it's, well, clearly the data says it's the case, but I don't know if I think it depends who you ask. Maybe.
And does it matter? Like, some of the measures where we've slipped the most or have the lowest scores are a mover, an up and comer, like, and maybe I was going to ask, what could we do to change those scores? But does it matter? Like, do you think as a country being known for the conservative, steady, trustworthy, do we just lean into that? Or should we feel second class because we don't have the reputation of being exciting and up and coming?
I mean, it's interesting because when you think of, vibrant, dynamic, you think of technology and how that sort of fuels the economy forward. And when you look at companies like Shopify, that's Canadian. And so I wonder in this conversation, is it that, Canadians have a reputation for being more humble and kind of losing an element of that Canadianness, like we've been talking about, as they get more successful, as companies, go international and experience that growth. But are we telling the story in the right way of that success right out the gate? Are we getting credit for our innovation and our talent? It seems like in some hands we are. So it's interesting that this data didn't reflect that.
Yeah, but so go ahead, Gotham.
No, that's a very interesting point you brought up there, Michelle, because when you were saying that, I was thinking of Shopify, but when you said that, we're also moving into an age where talent is becoming so much more fluid, right? If you want to access the best kind of technology talent, you can access it from anywhere in the world. You don't necessarily need to access it within the same market that you are in. And I feel an interesting differentiator is that the Canadian culture and infrastructure asks you to kind of put values first. And that kind of offers a differentiation to putting an outcome first. So it makes us good partners with everyone else globally. That's also a big reason. As a new immigrant, I can say why I see so many of my peers wanting to come to Canada, despite, let's say, slipping from 1 to 3. I don't think that's going to stop immigration anytime soon.
I totally agree. So one thing, I feel like we're living a historical moment together. We just found out that the Queen passed away. But two, I lost my train of thought, which I thankfully is not mine.
That's the beauty of editing. we can
what I wanted to say, let's give some time for the editor. So what I wanted to say is I'd be curious if the survey went in market today, if we would score above Germany because of what's going on in Europe right now, right? So I guess the point is we're living at such a fast changing moment in time that you need to take the data for what it is, which is a survey that was in market maybe 6 months ago, right? Or maybe three months ago. And we're living in a wildly different time. And I completely agree with you, Gautam, on Canada being like a very, very, very sort of like desirable place for immigrants to go to. And I had the conversation recently with our CCO who moved from South Africa in 4 years ago. So, and he was, I told him, why did you move, right? Because he already was like, he had a good job. It's not like he had a bad job. And he told me that he moved because he wanted his kids to have guaranteed access to good education. And we're talking about somebody who was already like ultra successful before in London or in South Africa. So I think all those things are not to be taken for granted, no matter the rankings, which are always changing anyway.
Well, it's the difference between substance and perception. And I think what I'm hearing in this conversation, the substance is there, but it's a little bit like, describing a comfortable shoe. It's like, well, that's really important. I can go hiking in it, but it sure doesn't sound very sexy. But frankly, if I'm going hiking, I would rather have a good hiking boot. And if you triangulate this data with like the Forbes data, and I think Rafiq, when you and I were speaking, were you saying The Economist also had a similar study on most livable cities? And Canada turns up with 3 of the top 10 most livable cities. And when they do the most livable cities data, they don't base it on perception. They actually look at quantitative data like cost of living and access to healthcare and access to education and so on and so forth, housing market. And on that front, a country the size of Canada to have 3 out of the top 10 markets in, I believe it's Vancouver, Toronto, and Calgary, is somewhat shocking. And I wonder if you could comment from your own experience or from your work, that gap between reality, which is the Forbes study, for example, and perception, which says, Canada's nice and it's progressive and it's trustworthy. It's a nice hiking boot. But Forbes would say, you actually want to buy this boot.
I think, I don't know if it's a comment on perception versus theory, but I think it rings very, very true to how I describe Canada whenever I'm talking to somebody outside or to a client from a different market looking to come into Canada. One of the things that always comes up is Canada is a country that punches above its weight, no matter what. Like the fact that we rank number 3 in like livability index in the best countries BAV study, the number of exports that we put out in terms of, even if they're never like recognized as Canadian, still we punch above our weight in music for a country so small, in sports as well. So I think that is a truth about Canadian, and that is a sexy truth, right? Because there is something that's interesting about the underdog, right? And it's always sort of like magnetic about the underdog. People love underdogs, and maybe that's why they love Canadians so much, because we're a country where like 90% of the territory is ice and snow. Or at least you don't want to live there. I don't know if it's ice and stuff, but you don't want to live there. And we're a very small country. We're only 30 million people, but we punch above our weight. And I think that's something that we should be extremely proud of.
I think you bring up a really interesting point on that, Rafiq. I think the stat is 90% of our population lives within 150 miles of US borders. So when you think about that and you think about the vastness that is our country, but how small our population size and how close it is to borders, and you think about the impact that that has on cities and livability, maybe that's why people don't, like, there's a lack of understanding because it's just impossible to really understand how big something can be with so few people, but in such concentrated areas, and how that has an impact on the work and where our clients are. And also when you layer in all of the different cultures that are represented, it really is difficult to define because of the factors that go into making it up. But I love saying that we punch above our weight, because I couldn't agree more.
No, I think that raises a really interesting point, Michelle. When you consider that Canadians and Americans, by and large, look the same, we speak similar languages. The French Quebec factor is a bit different, of course, but if you look across the broad swath of the US, it would be very hard to tease out who's a Canadian and who's an American. We live close to the border. We are a small country. All of these things make it harder and harder for us to be distinctive. It isn't like, Germany and France, different languages, different cultural iconography. So I think that does make it harder. There's changing gears a little bit. There's another observation. I will take no credit for it because I didn't make this observation. But in some countries, industries or brands have actually branded the country. So Japan, I'm old enough to remember when I was a child, Japan was not known as technologically advanced. It was a country of low-cost manufacturing. And then along comes, Sony, and all of a sudden we're starting to think of consumer electronics. And the US, more in my parents' day, but through the middle of the 20th century with Ford and GM was known as, big industry, and then along comes technology like Apple and Google and Microsoft and so forth. France, it has food, it has sophisticated brands associated with Paris mostly. Italy, leather goods, also quite sophisticated. Then you turn your attention to Canada. Our GDP for the next while is going to be driven by mining, natural resources, big part of our GDP. These are not consumer-facing brands. As industries, they kind of match that hiking boot analogy I was using. They're kind of big, solid. They don't move quickly up or down. They're kind of nice and steady. And I did think it was kind of interesting to think about Canada. We do have some brands that are visible. They tend to be in fashion, like Roots or Lululemon. But then after that, they're B2B brands. Do we think about Suncor and so forth? They're not high consumer awareness of those brands. So that's sort of an observation, not a question. Although from a question standpoint, do we have any brands, maybe our banking brands, that could be better leveraged on the world stage that would then rub off on the perception of Canada as a brand?
I really thought Shopify was having its moment with the pandemic, because it was exploding, and every single business out there, not just store, was sort of like opening up Shopify website, whether it's a restaurant or a small business or whatever. But I looked at data recently, and the e-commerce numbers have sort of like fallen to like pre-pandemic numbers. So it feels like that moment has fizzled away, and I hope it hasn't, because it's the company that I love. And I hope it's not going to be the next BlackBerry, right? Because that was also a moment, sort of like it felt like we had our moment. We had the brand, we had the sort of like it was in the right sector, you had the right sort of like tailwinds, but then it dropped the ball.
Yeah, I think e-commerce in general is in a way slowing down. It's not going to keep up with the massive growth, and the only reason is I think with everything opening up post-COVID. The contributions of e-commerce to any brand's real business bottom line is coming back to like the early 10s or sub 10s in some cases as well. So I think that value and that importance that we assumed it would skyrocket it's just probably more normalization than a decline. But I think the opportunity, my view of where some interesting brands in Canada will pop up is I do think in the fintech space, because you do have some interesting products and businesses like Neo World and stuff like that. That again, Neo is based out of Calgary. Imagine that, a fintech company based out of there, and they're doing some amazing work. And just the opportunity to create efficiencies in that fintech space is so huge in the market and huge across the Western world. I think we've got some great opportunities over there.
It could be the nice marriage of technology and financial services. And
Yeah.
we did get credit through the 2008-9 implosion for our conservatism and stability in banking.
Yeah.
Really saved us versus the US. And then if you marry that sort of consistency with technology, it could be a really interesting sweet spot for us to play in. Are there things that you think about coming up on the midterm elections in the US? So the US has taken, I'll try to say this without being completely objective, though very hard for me to do as an American. It has certainly taken a stride to the right in terms of social values, Supreme Court rulings, and so forth. We're coming up on the midterm elections that could go either way. I won't pass judgment. What impact do you think that will have on Canada, given all the things we're talking about Canada and the brand of Canada relative to what's happening to the brand USA? Ouch.
I think one area, and which might be very interesting, is Canada has been consistently and will consistently, whatever the outcome of the election is, going to allocate a lot more money towards education than they've ever done before. The budget on education was a little swept aside for the longest time, and now that's picking up. And I think the opportunity that Canada is seeing is a lot of young, intelligent talent wants to come and study here, which eventually will walk into our work stream. And I think that's such a huge opportunity, because everything as it gets, like, of course, the fact that education is getting more expensive is true, but if the government's able to support it in a lot better way than our friends down the border are, it can become a great entry point for talent into the market.
So let's try to do this. Oh, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, because I think that's a very interesting question about how sort of like the rightification, I guess, of the United States is going to affect our brand, right? And
because of what we were saying, because of the close proximity and context, right?
Yeah, and we have the benefit of sort of like having lived through the weird phrasing, the Trump presidency, and what we witnessed from Canada is sort of like doubling up on our values, right? It's sort of like, for me, it was the first time, like, I've been living in Canada since 1998. And Canada's values have always been sort of like a very hermetic, like inside Canada thing. But for the first time, there was an outside threat that was next door to our values, because of like the values that were sort of like becoming popular south of the border at that time. And what we saw is Canadians actually standing up for what they have historically believed in. And our prime minister was sort of like standing up to Trump at the time, which is like, if you think about it, it's pretty crazy, right? Like standing up to a superpower where we have like 2 tanks and 4 helicopters, but he was still doing it. So I think that's something that's fairly, again, to be proud of. And if we can use the past as sort of like a barometer for the future, I think Canadians care so much about their values that they'll just sort of like be more aggressive about defending them.
Well, okay, the 3 of you are strategists, so I'll put you on the spot. Let's try to write, this is the last question and we'll wrap up, but if we were to put together essentially the creative brief, the strategy for Canada based on the insight session we just had, some of the things we heard were our stability and progressiveness and openness could actually be quite sexy, even though we're not perceived as sexy. Our industries are not terribly sexy, and that might be holding us back from the perception. We talked about that may not really matter, because when we talk to people, the employment market, the talent market, which is so tight, everything we offer in Canada actually should drive immigration. and immigration typically has been quite welcome and quite open. So that should be a good thing because our labor market is predicted to stay tight through 2023. So we should be able to attract great talent. We have an enormously diverse population. I think Toronto is now, 50% born outside of Canada, which in and of itself should start to change our culture, I suppose, because there is no typical Canadian anymore. But with all these factors, how would you then, in an elevator conversation with someone, either a business person thinking of opening in Canada or a professional thinking of relocating her family or his family here, how would you sell Canada to them?
I would say there's so much more to Canada than you might think. So some of the stereotypes, think, hockey, plaid, frigid temperatures, and Canadians are courageous. So come join us and join sort of the next wave of Canadian courage, I'll say.
I like it.
No, what I think I would say is bearing all the sort of like very functional RTBs, which is like if you have USDs here, now's the moment to invest because your money is worth double and getting the same level of talent. I mean, Gotham worked in Singapore. We've got people who work everywhere in the world. So you're getting the same level of talent at the fraction of the price. But that's for me, that's just like the RTB. Like what I would tell the person on the elevator would be, you would be entering a country that is on the brink of not being a best kept secret anymore. Right? Because like we're amongst each other and we're like, oh my God, all these amazing things are happening. And I think we're at the inflection point soon where those things that we're saying are not sexy are going to become extremely desirable. And won't you want him to be at the ground floor of that? So that would be my
Nice. I think an interesting one is I'll actually say I'll a quick story because this was the first time I filed taxes in Canada and I got returns and the government gave me back money. So I was telling my wife, this is the first time
I need your accountant.
This is the first time in my life the government has ever given me back money instead of the other way around wherever I've lived. So in my returns, and I was like, I kind of do think that if you're looking for a partner who's here to support you long term, to get you where you want to be mentally, emotionally, financially, I'll come to Canada.
Yeah, it's the stuff for what really matters, for the stuff that's really important. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The cynical side of me thinks sane is sexy. Anyway, folks, thank you all very much for the time you spent with us this afternoon. If we have any follow-up questions, we know where to find you. I know where to find you. And I look forward to seeing you around our new campus here in Toronto.
All right. Thank you so much, Arthur. Thank you, Michelle, Gotham, Adele. Thank you so much.
See you guys.
Thanks,
Bye.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Well, I'm absolutely thrilled and delighted now to be joined by Dr. Stacey Graham, who is the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP. Stacey, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you for the invitation.
This year we see social purpose becoming significantly important, which is a good thing. Why do you think that's so?
I believe in the survey you define social purpose around a few categories such as caring about gender and racial equity, the environment, human rights, and so forth, right? And what we understand about humans is we have an innate desire to have a reason for being. That's another word for purpose. So I'd say if we look at what's happened in the world in the last 2.5, 3 years, that is definitely catapulted into the mainstream. We have all these things coming together that are pinpointing, illustrating how we're failing as a collective.
And do you think that failure as a collective is something that's now being exposed right across the globe?
Absolutely. I would say that even before 2020, we could see it happening, but there's something about a restriction of freedom of movement, right, that makes people sit at home and have nothing else to do but recognize and look into everything that's wrong with the world, if you will. And so I think that it's on people's minds. What does it mean to be in a collective when I'm sitting at home and can't leave my house anymore? What does it mean to really be connected as a society? How do we care for the most vulnerable? And to be really honest, with COVID-19, we didn't do a great job of that. So I think people are asking different questions than they were 2 to 3 years ago.
And I think I found it quite interesting to see the relationship between this movement, I mean, let's call it a movement, coming from the population upwards.
Absolutely. I mean, we also see that some of our health officials do move more politically than we would have expected. But there were people across the world who made the decision to wear a mask even when it was no longer mandated, who stayed at home even when they didn't want to, who got on the streets for probably the largest social movement since 1968, right? It was a global social movement to bring awareness to racial inequality. So I think there's a coming together even in times of divisiveness.
Now, one of the things we've seen in the study is this sort of interrelationship between a country's brand and companies' brands, and we're seeing that interrelationship even more sort of mingled and prevalent this year. So what should companies do to improve their social purpose in relation to how their country is seen?
That is a great question. I think that is something that they're still figuring out. But one thing we know for sure is people aren't simply incentivized by money. That's not enough to keep employees today. Employees want to work somewhere where they feel proud of not only the work that they do, but the things that the company stands for. They want to see their company standing up for social issues that they personally care about.
Stacey, why do you think suddenly companies are finding a political voice as opposed to purely a corporate voice?
I think to an extent, we have been able to observe this shift away. When I studied, there was a clear connection. The business strategy has to align with shareholder value. That's all we care about, maximizing shareholder value. And there was a notion that maximizing shareholder value stood in opposition to a social purpose, if you will. And today, I think people are recognizing that's actually not true. And we increase shareholder value when we can ensure that we have high employee engagement, low turnover, and people care about what they do in the company they work for.
Well, Stacey Graham, that's a fantastic place to stop. This whole topic is something that we are all going to have to understand a lot better, and not just understand it, but also ensure that it's actions as opposed to merely words. But for the moment, Dr. Stacey Graham, the Global Racial Equity Programs Director at WPP, thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you.
Hello and a very warm welcome. My name's David Roth and I'm the CEO of the store WPP and Chairman of BAV. Thank you very much indeed for joining me in this very special metaverse experience, exploring the WPP BAV Best Countries 2022 study in conjunction with Wharton Business School and US News. Here we are in the arrivals hall, where you'll be able to discover the key insights from this year's study relating to global trends. Here you'll also find exclusive interviews with global experts and analysis of the data. And what a year we've had. There have been a lot of changes from last year. From here you can also go and visit the 85 countries that are ranked in this year's report. Each of those countries have their own individual room where you can explore a wealth of data and insights into each individual country. You might well see some surprises along your journey. And in the departure area, you can discover more about the study itself. Enjoy your trip around the BAV Best Countries 2022 metaverse. Well, we're almost at the end of our broadcast. A big thanks to everybody from the local WPP companies who've participated, and of course our central team that's put together all of our Follow the Sun 24 hours of broadcasting, to our directors, to Indus Gupta, to Paul Reifer, and our producers, Sarah Cousins and Lady Victoria Robinson. Well, all it's left for me, David Roth at WPP, to say thank you very much indeed for joining, and the next broadcast follows shortly on the hour.